New York is the finest harbor in the Atlantic Ocean. You start there. And just as harbor, but it's so much more. It's an entrance into North America.
New York cannot be understood aside from its geography. Indeed, no city could. But New York more so than almost any city in the world, because here you have what's really a natural location for a great city. It's probably one of the three greatest harbors in the world. And then what's key is at the very heart of New York is an island, Manhattan. So that the Indians, who were not in most places in the United States in the early 17th century, were on the island of Manhattan because it was a natural location for a great city.
That's a clip from the beginning of the definitive documentary about New York City, Ric Burns' New York, a documentary film. As a natural location for a city, New York was sociologically and politically shaped, of course, by countless waves of new immigrants. But fundamentally, New York has always been a city shaped by water. The long, skinny island of Manhattan at its heart, Brooklyn and Queens to the east on Long Island, the borough of Staten Island, 5 miles south of Manhattan, and the Bronx, which is the only part of New York City on the American mainland, itself surrounded by water on 3 sides. If this week's megastorm is not simply a once-in-a-lifetime event, but rather a once-every-few-years event, as New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo is now arguing, then the whole country is faced with the question of how our largest American city, our biggest population center, our economic capital as a nation, will defend itself. It's a city built on water. What happens when our relationship without water changes fundamentally? Joining us now is documentary filmmaker Ric Burns. Mr. Burns, thank you very much for being here. I'm so happy you could come.
Oh, pleased to be here, Rachel.
New York City became an industrial center and became what it is in large part because of its natural geography. Do you think New York City is prepared to face a changing environment?
You know, I think arguably, it's a hard question to answer, but I think arguably more than any other place in the country. I mean, New York, geography has been destiny for New York as it is for all cities, but I think indeed more so for here. And I think that we're moving now into a new phase of its history. We have been for some time, but I think that Sandy underscores it really, really dramatically. With San Francisco and Hong Kong, one of the 3 greatest deep water ports in the world, that's why New York became New York. You know, 1,000 ships, the Dutch could see it in the 17th century, could ride at anchor in New York Harbor. New Yorkers had an extraordinary ability to leverage from the start that geography. So not content with the geography which nature had given them in the early 19th century under DeWitt Clinton, they went out and built the Erie Canal, a 363-mile ditch that connected New York Harbor via the Hudson River and the Great Lakes to the hinterlands of America. So that meant that not only did they have the greatest natural port in the Western Hemisphere, everything grown, mined, harvested had to come down right by the battery that was flooded 3 days ago. I think if the first age of New York was the New York that the harbor provided, and the second age of New York was the New York that the Erie Canal created, and really created the city you and I are speaking in this evening, I think we're right now on the cusp of the third age of New York. Geography has twice worked fantastically to New York's advantage. Now there's kind of a blowback taking place. But I think that New York has always been pioneering because of these extraordinary geographical advantages and the surge of population and commerce that's taken place here. It's been on the forefront of new things, new peoples, new ideas, new products, new markets, but it's also been on the forefront since the beginning of new problems. It has sort of pioneered new urban problems, new ways of crowding people together in tenements, new ways of not having water for people, not being able to provide them with jobs. And so what that's meant is from the start, New York has always been pioneering new solutions, not because New Yorkers are better, but because quite often they just got there first. We're the petri dish.
This is most of why I wanted to talk to you, because I feel like what's happening here, and this came up with New Orleans in a different way in terms of talking about Katrina, but what's happening here is that as a country, we are realizing that we have a problem that our politics is not up to at the national level. But so much of what is right about public policy, especially that affects geographic areas, that affects big swaths of our country in terms of the land, is innovated by people who are forced there despite politics.
That's absolutely right. It's not a Democrat, it's not a Republican thing.
Right.
It's circumstances, partly sort of by dint of geography, and partly human-made. I mean, we cause these problems. You know, in the case of New York, it has constantly had to find out new ways to connect itself to itself. So it builds a subway system. It finds new ways to shelter its infrastructure from storm. Blizzard of 1888 comes. All of New York's telegraph and brand new telephone are above ground. And you see those photographs of the late 1880s. Where do they go? Underground. And at the very same time, New Yorkers became aware that you couldn't have public transportation all above ground. It was too in jeopardy by the weather. What do they build? A subway system. Well, that's in 1904. Here we are, a little more than a century later, dealing with a new set of problems caused very much by the culture that New York's in the vanguard of, a fantastically successful commercial culture, which now has the ability to reach out and not just build an Erie Canal, it can reach out and change the climate of the entire globe. So what are you going to do in that situation? You're going to have to find new, non-ideological, non-political ways to find new mechanisms, structural, infrastructural, to deal with the consequences of your collective behavior. And here's the thing, those kind of solutions cannot be privatized. That's what we know. They are by definition public and collective problems, and the solutions need to come publicly and collectively. And New York has, again, not because New Yorkers are better, but just because the problems have come so fast and thick here, has more experience with dealing with those kind of large macro problems when they're generated by human beings. And therefore I feel, at the risk of sounding Pollyannish, I feel that the great silver lining of this immense storm system is going to be that it happened here, and New Yorkers are used to thinking outside their own box, to creating not just a Manhattan, but a greater New York that's 5 boroughs wide, and then creating the first kind of like, megalopolis stretching up and down the East Coast. Now they're having to think, we're going to have to think collectively, as a city, as a state, and as a nation, of how we invent infrastructure to deal with the consequences of our own prosperity.
Rooting this challenge and what we're going through right now in the historical can-do public capacity of New York is, for me, very grounding and very helpful, and it's why I wanted to talk to you tonight. Ric Burns, currently working on an update to New York, a documentary film. Episode 9 is going to air in early 2014.
That's exactly right.
Ric Burns, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Okay, we do have one other important news story tonight from the world of politics to report in just a moment, but I do want to show you something first. So there's this blackout zone covering a huge portion of America's largest city right now, almost all of Lower Manhattan and New York City without power for 2 full days now and counting. If you have ever looked